startups begin in communities across the country.
Why does Silicon Valley get so much credit? My name is Nick Kastner.
And I'm Caitlin Clays. We're interviewing the people building startup communities across America.
But in the areas no one is talking about, the middle.
This is the Ecosystem Builder Podcast by mug.news.
Today's ecosystem builder is Tommy Feltz, the editor-in-chief of Startland News. Startland News is a nonprofit newsroom dedicated to covering Kansas City's innovation, tech, and entrepreneurial community. Tommy, thank you so much for joining us.
Great to be here.
We first connected on LinkedIn, and I have, of course, been aware of Startland News for the past few years, just being such a big player in the Midwest tech space that when I got the LinkedIn connection, I was taken aback. So thank you for the connection, and I'm really looking forward to kind of nerding out about Midwest media. But to start with, Tommy, if you could kind of give a background to yourself and how you landed at Startland News as editor-in-chief.
I started, it seems like 100 years ago, if you can tell by the gray hairs on my chin, but I started as a business reporter down in Paris, Texas. Very quickly realized, or I thought I realized I didn't like business reporting and vowed to never do it again. Went into the pagination and design side of newspapers. So I was in print journalism for 12, 15 years, kind of working my way through the production side of things to becoming a kind of shift editor before managing editor, and then eventually was the publisher of the newspaper that I was working at here in Kansas. Eventually, the newspaper where I worked was purchased by a hedge fund. So it went from kind of family ownership to corporate ownership. It wasn't a great fit for me. So after a year or so of that, kind of started looking for other opportunities. During my course as managing editor, I worked with a lot of really talented young reporters, some of them that I hired out of college. One of those was Bobby Birch, who had actually worked with me fresh out of college. We did some pretty hardcore, community journalism covering everything from, political races to a quadruple homicide, the kind of stuff that you encounter in small towns that you don't really think about. He ended up leaving our newspaper to go work for the Kansas City Business Journal, later left the Kansas City Business Journal to start Startland News, was one of the kind of founders of the nonprofit newsroom that we have. When I decided to leave corporate journalism, I reached out to him just to see if there was anything open in Kansas City that he knew about. And they were actually creating a position at Startland News that I was a good fit for. Ultimately, he ended up leaving Startland News as kind of part of the gig economy storytelling apparatus in Colorado, and now more broadly, I think, covering some national tech news. But I started with Startland News in July 2017.
You mentioned not really dig into business journalism at first. What didn't you like, and then what drew you back into it?
I just thought it was boring. So my time in community journalism, I think, prepared me to come back to it, which was to kind of take another look at what business reporting can be. And in the process of those 12, 15 years that I was in community journalism, learned a lot about really telling any story with a face. So, if you're talking about a topic, find somebody to be the face of that topic, to humanize it, to make it so that people can relate to it. So that's really what we've tried to do with Startland News since I arrived, is talk more about the founders and the entrepreneurs behind the businesses. There's definitely a place for like totally straight news reporting when there's a funding round or an exit or whatever. But if you get beat on that initial story, especially, you've got to find a different angle. And a lot of times that angle can be, what was the process to, the journey to get here, or what is it that entrepreneur can teach people about this moment or from this moment for when they're preparing for their big, VC round or whatever. But we also do a significant number of feature stories too, where we just kind of find out about somebody cool and then try to tell their story, how they got there, and hopefully a little about where they're going.
Absolutely. And the value of storytelling, there's a tremendous value of storytelling to ecosystem building, that it gives a community, they're like champions and they know the entrepreneurs. But then also like myself, I've definitely been to Kansas City, but I'm not very familiar with the business scene. I can hit Startland News and quickly become familiar with the major players in Kansas City. Did Startland start as a nonprofit organization, or has what's kind of the progression of the company?
Yeah, it started as a not profiting for-profit, as my understanding goes. I wasn't there for any of that portion of it. I started right at the same time as we became a nonprofit. We're technically classified as an education nonprofit because our parent organization also operates a program that's education focused, that does a lot of teacher development and also work with students to try to help students learn entrepreneurial thinking early on, not necessarily so that they will become entrepreneurs in the future, but so that they'll have the problem solving skill set to, like make it in life. Sometimes that lends itself to starting a business. Sometimes it just, teaches you how to solve problems and think about things a little bit more analytically. Mm-hmm. But yeah, the outset, I think, was a for-profit venture that was a little bit more in the traditional mindset of what an upstart newsroom could sort of look like. Leaning into the nonprofit newsroom is actually where since then, we've seen a lot more people going in that direction for investigative journalism and public service journalism. We actually have quite a few colleagues at nonprofit newsrooms in Kansas City that we're working with and collaborating with now, because we all kind of have the same, from a journalism standpoint, kind of the same mission of, just getting information out there. We just kind of do it in different ways. Like you said, a big part of business reporting is raising awareness, it's exposure. We kind of value a lot of what we do for that exposure piece, both, providing exposure for the businesses that we're writing stories about, but also the element of, a reader is looking at these businesses, whether they're like you and kind of looking at Kansas City from the outside, or somebody in Kansas City learning about what's actually going on around them. We're hoping that, these stories can, in addition to, the direct transfer of information about what's happening, but also inspire people to realize, if this guy down on Southwest Boulevard has a apparel company and I think I want to do that, there's nothing stopping me. And just providing a lot of examples of what people can accomplish, whether it's a high-tech startup or a small business, a restaurant. Like we've kind of grown to cover a pretty wide variety of things.
I asked this next question because nonprofit journalism it seems even over the last 2 years has really began to develop, and you see these organizations propping up across the country. And of course, over the last decade, local journalism has been very fractured in the conglomerate and that whole progression. How is Startland News funded? Is it mainly like donor backed, or could you provide some insight into, I guess, the structure of that?
Mm-hmm. We have a mix of funding. So there's some grant funding, there's some reader donations, there's some corporate sponsors. I guess when I say reader donations too, we will be kicking off a donor campaign pretty soon, but it'll only be our second since we started 6 years ago. We really hadn't leaned in too much in asking readers for direct support until we really wanted to prove that we were providing a value to them. But the reader support mix is a little bit of small dollar donors from everyday readers and donors, and then we have people that are individuals within the community that see the power of the work that we do and kind of feel like they're investing in the business community by donating to us. And then there's corporate sponsorships that help us put on, experiences, whether they're in person or virtual. Some of our larger in-depth pieces might have a sponsor on them. We try to, in the journalism world, make sure that we're maintaining our integrity and ethics and everything, and denoting everything that's sponsored in some way. But yeah, I mean, that's the basic model. Our biggest funder, biggest single funder is the Kauffman Foundation, because our work aligns with a lot of their priorities right now.
Yes, absolutely. I would have potentially guessed that without even they're a huge supporter of the ecosystem, both in Kansas City, but then also much more broad than that.
They're big supporters of most of the nonprofit newsrooms, if not all, in Kansas City. I think kind of what you're mentioning about local news kind of fracturing quite a bit. I mean, as we've seen. Corporate journalism, which I mean is just, the internet decimated newsrooms in a variety of ways. They had to turn to corporations to continue making things work. That causes cutbacks. What we've seen develop with these nonprofit newsrooms is essentially most of them are almost like niche publications. And it's sort of like the beats have fractured. So like Startland News is kind of, a business beat. The Beacon in Kansas City is kind of the public service, oftentimes, government reporting. And it used to be all of these things would be in a massive, 600 person newsroom in the heart of Kansas City. And now we're kind of fractured out. And I think in some ways positioned to, better cover the community than we were. But it's a challenge to, bring everybody together and communicate and find ways to make the funding work.
Yes, yeah, and the funding seems like the most difficult thing to figure out. I had a conversation with a fellow media entrepreneur / leader and he's based out of Lincoln, but that was a big topic of discussion of just like, how do you figure that out? Because the organizations that have figured it out are really thriving, but it definitely is a challenge. Tommy, to get more into the Kansas City ecosystem specific questions, what's one thing people on the outside may not know about Kansas City?
I was on a panel last night and wanted to ask a similar question about sort of what had surprised folks about Kansas City, especially over the past 2 years. I think that what I would say is that people always talk about collaboration between startups and collaboration between organizations. And we talk about that as though it's an absolute. I think that there are a lot of collaborations going on in Kansas City, but it might surprise people, I think, how siloed Kansas City is when it comes to even within the ecosystem. I mean, Startland News was founded with the idea that we were going to help to break down these pillars of the ecosystem, whether that was, government, education, startups, corporate. And I think that there's been some breakdown of those things. But as we start to cover more regionally, as we sort of look at what Casey Rising, which is a regional initiative, is working on now, these silos are still there. And it's just kind of amazing to imagine the kind of work that could be doing across the ecosystem, across the region, if these things were broken down and people were talking to each other more. I think we're starting to see a little bit of it, but it's kind of like with work from home. 2 or 3 years ago, people were insistent we're never going to do that until they were made to do it. Mm-hmm. So I don't know what the catalyst is to start tearing down some of these walls that have remained up. But I think a lot of that is what's preventing some of the growth in Kansas City, is sort of the crossover between corporate and startup. You see little bits of, Cerner working with somebody on an innovation project, but are some of these big corporations really tapping into the startup ideas? I don't know. It doesn't seem like it. One of the things that we hear the most is talking to a founder and they say, I used to work at Cerner, or I used to work at Hallmark. I used to work at Garmin. I used to work wherever. And it, just spotlights. They felt like to do the kind of innovation that they wanted, they had to leave that corporation. So how do we tear down the walls, whether it's between education and healthcare, or healthcare and startups, or corporations and startups, or corporations and education? How do we tear down those walls so that we can all figure out how to make this work together?
Yeah, yes. And what's interesting is I don't think Kansas City is alone in like with the siloed ecosystem. And there's so many facets to the problem. And sometimes it's entrepreneurs themselves getting competitive and not wanting to like share resources or information. But then also the pandemic has its own, like there's a whole cast of characters that I used to see at events or at coffee shops over the last 18 months. I haven't had those collisions as frequently. So definitely interesting. On that, where are the places that entrepreneurs tend to meet each other between like coffee shops or co-working spaces? Are there any like OG, if you will, like entrepreneurial hangouts in Kansas City?
Currently?
Yeah.
I don't know. The ones that you would find people at on a weekly basis, have changed dramatically. You might still run into people at, Messenger coffee shop in the Crossroads, or some of the coffee shops that were kind of the places where you went, not necessarily maybe you went there for a specific coffee meeting, but you also kind of went there just to see who you would bump into. A lot of that sort of like voyeuristic, also like hoping for some serendipity, I think has vanished a little bit, because now it's a little bit like less predictable as to who you're going to run into, because you might run into just a bunch of random people who wouldn't have been out during the day previously, but now their work structure has changed and they're just out, and they're on this, weird kind of work schedule that startup people almost, exclusively had in the Crossroads before. Now it's almost like people gravitate toward the rare events that we're starting to see pop back up. So last week we had Techstars demo day. So I wasn't able to attend because I had a sick kid at home, but looking at the photos from one of our reporters, a lot of the cast of characters, like you said, that used to be at some of our regular events. The Pure Pitch Rally is coming up in Kansas City, which is also, event that usually a lot of the, top people from those pillars I mentioned earlier. That's one of the events that a lot of people come together for, where you see everybody from civic leaders to corporate leaders to startups to people who run restaurants. All kind of mingling together, for a common cause. And in this particular case, to check out some of the newest startup tech companies that are coming up in Kansas City. So, I don't know if that's what it's going to be like now. It kind of seems like it, that people are more willing to come out for the sure thing, where they know they're going to bump into people that they want to see. But it's only my little sliver of the world, so I'm not sure.
Yeah. Interesting. What entrepreneur and startup are you most excited about in Kansas City right now?
I was thinking about a startup the other day, a founder of a startup. It's on our startups to watch list, actually. But a woman named Janae Gamage, who runs what's called the Agency Base now. In the process of working on a story right now, a follow-up story. But when I think about what founders look like in Kansas City, she is kind of the future of what I think startup founders look like. She has a pretty exciting company. She has a really big heart to where she's sort of pivoting her company and where she's going with it. At the same time, you also have really exciting founders like Doss at Triple Blind, who came out of the iVerify exit several years ago, and a lot of just really cool tech startups. I tend to gravitate actually more toward small business owners and creative people and that spectrum of entrepreneurs generally. To broadly overcharacterize, sometimes tech startup people are, so into the inner workings of their startup that they aren't able to communicate their journey and their story as well as they are able to communicate the startup's journey. And as we kind of look at the people behind companies, that's where it's a little bit more, easy to tell the human story with somebody that's a little bit more people facing than tech facing. But there are a lot of exciting people in Kansas City. And I would say that's what drives the folks on our team is, working with people who are really interesting to put together these stories. It is easy to fall into the trap of being criticized as like a cheerleader for the companies. A lot of the stories we write are fairly positive because they're about, progress in businesses. They're about, as we say, previously when I was, working in a newspaper and you're covering car wrecks and fires and murders and things like that, you're often talking to people on the worst day of their life. When you get a chance to work somewhere where you're talking to people on the best days of their lives, it really kind of changes the tone of the reporting and how you report on things. But the flip side of that is that we're not afraid to talk about, failure stories. We're not afraid to talk about, the pivot and why they had to pivot. You can't really help people understand the story without talking about the darker pieces of it. Mm-hmm. So I think that's been one of the really enjoyable and satisfying parts of working at Startland News for me, is to, bring the stories together, generally in a way that ends with a solution, whether it's, the solution to that personal story or the startup journey or whatever it might be.
On that vein, what is one or a few of the stories you're most proud of that Startland has published in the last year?
You're going to make me think. I can only think back like a week at this point.
Okay.
We publish about 520 stories a year.
Oh, wow.
And I have actually fairly good recall when it comes to remembering details. But then if you ask me a question like that, I get a little flummoxed. Yeah. Some of the stories that we find the most impactful are when we find out that something happened after the story. So my mind immediately jumps to a story that we did a couple months ago that it was actually a sponsored content piece for a co-working space where they selected some of their members to be profiled. But we wrote about a company called Beyond Borders that I hope that's a name after I said I have great recall, but they produce these indigenous blankets that are sold internationally. And because of our story, they were able to connect with a local retailer. And that's a small connection, but it's one that shows like, not only do we potentially, help tell a tech startup story to a VC in Chicago, on the like smaller level, we helped a maker connect to someone who's going to sell their product. And to me and kind of our operation, those two things are equally important. As we've expanded what Startland News does and the stories that we've decided to tell, we really wanted to expand, the definition of entrepreneur beyond high tech, high growth startup to be, the small businesses, the creative people, the artists selling their work, the makers creating jewelry, things like that, because the thread between all of them is this journey. And that's what, people gravitate toward.
Absolutely. Yes. And you also end up featuring a more diverse cast of characters if your definition of entrepreneurship isn't so narrow as high tech, high growth startup. So definitely that's a good answer, Tommy. I like it. So we ask for every ecosystem builder, we ask about the media outlets that cover their ecosystem very well. And with Kansas City, we've had people say Startland News. That's always our first answer. But I'm interested from your perspective, are there any other blogs, podcasts, or media companies that you think do a very good job at covering the ecosystem? Not quite to the same level as Startland, but is there a competitor, if you will, that does a good job?
We see the media ecosystem as kind of this stair-stepped landscape. So I think most of the different publications that touch on media or touch on business kind of have their step that they focus on. So Startland News is probably where I would say, the core, and I'll say best. We'll just say that because I want to. Some of the best reporting on startups and early stage businesses happening. We really pride ourselves on sort of being a discovery outlet. And what we like to see then is, and we know because journalists at other outlets have told us that they follow us and use our email newsletters and things for story tips. We like to see the stories that we report on, picked up by TV stations, by the Kansas City Business Journal, by, any number of the magazines around town that oftentimes, are just touching on business and, amongst the catalog of things that they report on. A lot of the publications in town are a little bit more personality driven, so they can report on a broader spectrum of things. But there are personalities in the business community, so it's cool to see them, pick those up. Kansas City Magazine is a good example of one that, has a print magazine format and a digital storytelling operation that, comes into the same space, not really startup, but more business. When we talk about startups, probably the Kansas City Business Journal is the one that's doing the most startup reporting besides us. And then, as these companies get bigger, they start getting reported on more by the Star and Ingram's Magazine and some other publications regionally and locally.
Yeah, and that stair step you just illustrated is illustrates again the value of having an organization devoted to telling startups, that there's just more stories for then journalists as you go up the stairs to pull from and just be aware of. Last question for you, Tommy. If I were to move to Kansas City tomorrow and wanted to start a business, what is the first thing I should do?
First thing most people probably do is probably just start Googling. I wouldn't advise that though. There are a lot of resources in Kansas City, and just telling somebody this yesterday, we had a startup founder who recently returned within the last year to Kansas City. She had a startup. She left and went to another community because at the time, the only thing she knew as far as resources in Kansas City were Techstars and maybe 1 million cups, and didn't think that her company fit the mold for either one of those things. But I mean, KC SourceLink locally is a great resource. The Enterprise Center in Johnson County is a great resource. And then both of those organizations and their associated organizations, they're kind of along for the ride with them. Probably shouldn't phrase it like that, but they have a lot of partners that are too many to mention because they've both done a really good job of creating hubs of resources. Both of those are where I would send somebody to. If you want to learn about like what's obviously already happening, Startland News is a great place to get you started on that. But we don't profess to provide any tips or any step-by-step instructions to anything. Ours is a little bit more. We want to organically share these stories and let you see the activity, let you see the faces of what entrepreneurship in Kansas City looks like. There's also KC BizCare is a city office that helps people get businesses started. So if you're looking for, like logistically, how do I do this? KC BizCare is a great resource. KC SourceLink can connect you to any number of resources. And then ECJC that I mentioned has a lot of really great programming. So.
Okay, amazing, Tommy. Well, thank you so much for taking the time this morning, and it was also great to put a face to the name and chat with you some. So thank you so much for coming on.
Thank you for having me.
Now that we've learned about an ecosystem from the person building it, I'm going to link back up with Caitlin to clarify some jargon and take a deeper dive into this community.
Good morning, Nick. How are you?
Caitlin, I am doing great. It is great to see you this morning. It seems like it's been a minute since we like even linked up and saw you. So I hope everything is going great for you.
It really is. So why don't you go ahead and tell me about your interview with Tommy?
So Tommy, I really loved even just connecting with him. He's a great guy to have in our network. And after the show, he said, after our conversation, he said he'd help with future interviews, and he'll just be a good guy to kind of have in our back pocket. And I'm happy he's in our corner. So yeah, it was wonderful. It was really good.
So what would you say is one of your bigger takeaways?
I would say I was reminded at the importance of storytelling for an ecosystem, and to have those media outlets that can build up the champions, so to speak, that everyone knows who the up and coming entrepreneurs are, or the successful entrepreneurs, and it really just does inspire the next generation of entrepreneurs and startup employees and investors. So that's something I've always like, just doing what we do. I've always known how important it is, but it was great to have that conversation with Tommy and like, I guess, highlight that here on this show, and just be reminded of it again.
And that storytelling process is so much fun, especially like the ups and downs, because no one person's story is the same. So it was really cool to get to hear more about his perspective and take on that kind of stuff.
Absolutely.
So was there anything that you had to look up?
Not necessarily. Besides, I hit their website again, and it's a good, especially if you live in Kansas City, but any of the surrounding areas or throughout the Midwest, it's a good, Startland is a good resource just to kind of have as a favorite on the browser that I kind of check in once a week, with like when I make my like mug.news rounds, Silicon Prairie News. So I would say I looked up their website again after the conversation, but there was it wasn't super jargony, and Tommy being coming from journalism, he did not get very like ecosystem words, you know?
Yeah. So did you have any final thoughts?
I would say that my final thought, and Caitlin, you may be able to speak to this, but there's not that many people or that I know or like see on a regular basis that work in media. So like a lot of my friends who work at like insurance or one's an accountant, they don't always get what I do on the day to day. But Tommy for sure. I mean, he's an editor-in-chief of a media outlet. He definitely, that was something we could connect over, and like we didn't even specifically talk about it, but it was just great to. It was great to like look at someone and they know exactly what you do, and then vice versa.
That reminds me so much of the last time I was home with my family. One of my uncles was like, yeah, no, we don't really know what you do. And so, that is very refreshing to be able to chat with someone who knows like exactly what you're both are up to. So
yeah, most definitely. Yeah, Caitlin, so that is it. Do you want to read us out?
Yeah, right on. Thank you for listening to today's episode of the Ecosystem Builder Podcast, which is a product of mug.news and is hosted by Nick Kastner and Caitlin Clays. If you have any questions about today's episode, connect with us on Twitter at Nick Kastner, at Clays Creates, or at mug.news official. If you enjoyed the episode, please leave a review and share with your friends. We release episodes every Wednesday morning, so make sure to follow so you don't miss a beat.
Bye-bye.